This week on The Futurists, Cory Doctorow.
I think optimism and pessimism are really flip sides of the same kind of dismal coin that holds that the world will either get better or worse, but it doesn't matter what we do, right? That this is, defeats you before you even get out of bed in the morning. I'm a person with a lot of hope.
Well, welcome back to The Futurists. I'm Rob Tercek,
Hey.
co-host Brett King. Hi, Brett. Great to see you finally connecting together. You're
Yeah,
in Tokyo.
we have it. I mean, I had Pablos Holman on, and the other one I recorded recently, which I didn't have the chance to have you on because the time zones didn't work. But it's great finally for us to be recording a show back together again.
Good to be back. Good to be back with you.
How is the situation in Los Angeles with?
Everything's fine now. So, the fire's ended. We got a little rain and we immediately sink back into instant amnesia. And so no one's going to change anything here. We're going to continue rebuilding the houses in Malibu. And 10 years from now, you'll hear the same story. It happens like clockwork.
Well, we do have a guest, and he's written about the impact of climate in California. So it's going to be great to sort of get his perspective on this as well.
Well, why don't we jump right into it?
Yeah.
Cory Doctorow, welcome to The Futurists. We're thrilled to have you here. We're both big fans. I've been reading your books for years, and I'm a Boing Boing fan from way back when. I was a friend of Zini Jardin back in the day. Super great to meet you now, and thank you for joining us here on the show.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you very much.
Cory, you're right now
on your book tour right now.
Yeah, you're on a book tour. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I'm in New York today. I'll be in Penn State tomorrow, then Doylestown, Pennsylvania, Baltimore, DC, Richmond, Virginia, and then Austin for South by and some bookstore events. And then I head off to Stuttgart and a whole bunch of other places, about 25 cities.
Doesn't it feel a little arcane to be doing a physical book tour for a physical book in 2025?
I have to say, I mean, this is probably the wrong thing to say to people who run a video podcast, but I'm so sick to the back teeth of watching people talk on video screens. So, I feel like it is very easy to attend a virtual book launch by letting it run on your phone while it's in your pocket and you're like cleaning the litter pan. I don't think you get much out of it, and I don't think the author sells a lot of books that way. So, I think these in-person things make a difference. They certainly expose me to a lot of readers and colleagues. I work in a lot of side gigs while I'm around. So yesterday I was in Toronto. I had done a bookstore event, but I also gave the Ursula Franklin lecture at Innis College at U of T and met with a bunch of grad students. And it was it's a good day. I get to do sort of stuff that relates to my day job at the Electronic Frontier Foundation while I'm traveling around, meeting with people, meeting with academics, meeting with activists. This morning I was on Democracy Now!, doing stuff that is both my day job and my vocation.
Now, for the folks who are listening who are less familiar with your books than they should be, you really have two kind of trades. One is you're a journalist about the information economy, but you're also a science fiction writer. And tell us a little bit about Picks and Shovels, and then how does that fit into that scheme?
Sure. I would say I'm actually three things. I'm an activist as well. I've worked with EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, for 23 years now. So Picks and Shovels is a science fiction novel. It's the third novel starring my forensic accountant, two-fisted hero, Martin Hench, whose story is that he spends 40 years in Silicon Valley unwinding every weird finance scam that a tech bro can imagine. He's the Zelig of high-tech finance crime. I wrote this book under weird circumstances. The first of these Martin Hench novels is called Red Team Blues. It came out in 2023. And I wrote it during lockdown. I write when I'm anxious. So during lockdown, I sat in my backyard hammock in Los Angeles and wrote 9 books. And this was one of them.
Wow.
And I sent it to my editor. And the next morning, he sent me back a very short email that said, that was a ride. Whoa. And he bought 3 of them. And this novel had a very odd premise. I had the idea that you could write the last volume of a long-running series without bothering to write the rest of the series, and that would carry over a certain kind of anticipatory energy. So I think you could do this with TV too. I'd love to see a weekly show that was just the last episode of a sitcom that didn't exist. Uh, Different, sort of that final episode of MASH energy every week. So I wrote this book. My editor loved it. He bought two more, and I had to figure out what to do because Marty Hench in that book is 67 years old. He's got his one last job. He, earns his retirement. Let's put it that way. And while there is some precedent for taking a detective out of retirement, you have Conan Doyle bringing Holmes back over Rickenbach Falls, but that was because Queen Victoria told him she'd knight him if he did. And even if your editor is like a vice president of the Macmillan Company, he cannot offer you a knighthood. But I had this idea that I could write these books in any order. That because this guy had been in Silicon Valley for 40 years, I could tell the tale of any scam, and there would be a place for Marty Hench in it. And that, moreover, when you're writing out a sequence, you don't have to worry about continuity, right? If there's something that doesn't seem to line up, you just write a book between the 2 points that reconciles them. In fact, the more stuff you make up, the more of a premeditated you seem to be because you're just pulling it all together. So it makes for very satisfying read. Which brings me to Picks and Shovels. This is the third of these books, and it's Marty Hench's first adventure. It's set during the wild and weird era of the early PC. In the early 1980s, Marty Hench starts his career as a prototypical MIT screw-up. He flunks out of his computer science program because he's too busy programming computers to get a computer science degree. And he ends up in an accounting program because the community college has bought a lab full of Apple II Pluses, and that's his chance to play with a very expensive piece of hardware. And then he follows his rock star programmer roommate out to Silicon Valley, where amazing things are happening, and finds himself in a trade war between two weird PC companies. One of these weird PC companies is actually a pyramid scheme. It's called Fidelity Computing. It's run by a Mormon bishop, an Orthodox rabbi, and a Catholic priest. And they do predatory faith sales where they work through their parishioners to exploit one another, exploit the bonds of trust between them, to sell these junky PCs that are designed to lock you in and pick your pocket. So like even things like the fanfold paper for the tractor feed printers have the tractor feed holes sprocketed just slightly wider than normal paper. So you have to buy their paper at a 10x multiple to print out your documents. And the floppy drives are gimmicked to take their special floppy disk. I mean, basically, it's the Apple model, but in the 1980s, right? It's the Mac model, but in the 1980s.
Don't give Apple any more ideas, man.
Yeah.
It's like...
So the rival company is called Computing Freedom, and it was founded by three tearaway employees, three former sales managers. One is an Orthodox woman who's been kicked out of her family because she came out as lesbian. One is a Mormon woman who's left the faith because of the LDS opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment. And one is a nun who's left her order and joined up with the Liberation Theology movement in Central America during the Dirty Wars. And they've made it their mission to repent of their sins and liberate all the parishioners they locked into these crappy PCs by building interoperable hardware and software, things that let you export your data, use anyone's floppy drive, use anyone's printers, and so on and so on. And it turns out that the kind of clerics who are willing to make millions of dollars by exploiting people in their faith group are not going to go easily, and in fact are not above spectacular acts of violence to defend their multi-million-dollar grift. And so what starts as a commercial battle turns into a shooting war. And it's all set in this moment where Reaganomics, neoliberalism, the dismantling of competition law, they're all kicking into gear. And the stuff that leads inexorably to today's gentrification, to the degradation of the internet into 5 giant websites filled with screenshots of text from the other 4, where it's just getting started. And so it's a way to do historical fiction that works in the way that maybe futuristic fiction does too, as a kind of toy world where you call attention to certain elements that illuminate things about today that are omnipresent but hard to put your finger on, so that you come away with a better understanding of what's going on today by thinking about the past or the future.
It seems to me during the pandemic, you were probably ruminating on the origins of vacation. I know that was a big theme at the time, and I suppose that's what brought you to this place where you wrote a story about the origins of this stuff. But tell me about the connection to organized religion, because it seems like there's a not subtle critique going on there.
Well, one of the things that was a precursor to neoliberalism and what you might call like gotcha economics or caveat emptor economics, the whole cryptocurrency ethos, not your keys, not your wallet. We've built a system where if someone steals from you, you can't get your money back, and that's your problem, not ours. You should just be smarter. Donald Trump is accused on stage in 2016 of cheating on his taxes, and he says that makes me smart, and we vote for him and elect him. So that moment, it arises in part out of the legalization and legitimization of pyramid schemes. So in the Nixon era, there was one extremely virulent pyramid scheme called Amway. Amway had been founded by Betsy DeVos's father-in-law, a guy called Rich DeVos. She was Trump's education head in the 2016 administration, and by Jay Van Andel, who was the most powerful business lobbyist in the world. He ran the Chamber of Commerce, and the FTC had been about to shut them down because they were incredibly predatory. They worked through faith groups, and it was a cult selling model where people would be convinced to take all of their disposable income and quote unquote invest in Amway stuff that no one wanted to buy. And then when they failed, they were told that it was because of their moral and personal failings, and they were bilked out of thousands of dollars more to attend motivational seminars to learn how to be better Amway salespeople. There's something really interesting about this because, as someone who's very interested in labor politics and labor organizing, this is kind of the bizarro world version of labor organizing, because you take these people who are very outgoing, who are respected in their communities, who are good at talking with people, and you teach them how to have a structured conversation that's meant to change the behavior of people around them. But while a union organizer is trained to teach other people how to be solidaristic, a pyramid seller is taught how to exploit and destroy solidarity, vaporizing it and leaving behind money that has to be kicked up your upline to the people who founded the cult. And so just as the FTC is about to clobber Amway, Nixon resigns and Ford becomes president. Ford had been the congressman to Jay Van Andel and Rich DeVos, and he instructed the FTC to craft a rule, the Amway rule, that legalizes Amway. So you are not a pyramid scheme provided you do what Amway was doing then. And every pyramid scheme today, anyone who's like looking you up on Facebook that you went to high school with and trying to sell you like essential oils or, leggings or whatever, they are following the Amway model, like literally following the Amway playbook, which legalized things. So we're in this moment where faith groups are seeing an explosion of pyramid selling right as PCs are kicking off. And there's a thing economists sometimes call it the Byzantine premium, where investment opportunities that people don't understand can attract a premium because people assume that like a pile that big has to have a pony under it somewhere, right? So this is, cryptocurrency and metaverse and so on. And back then PCs were the mysterious hot thing of the day on the cover of all the weekly magazines, and you were told that it was going to change the whole world. No one knew what they were. I mean, I grew up in Toronto, and the Ontario Ministry of Education built a PC. They had a computer called the Sammy Icon. It was actually a very weird computer. It booted 3 different operating systems, one of which was a logo shell, and it had inset into the molded plastic of the keyboard a trackball like you'd get on an arcade game of Centipede, so that you could direct your logo turtle. It was like just the weirdest goddamn thing you've ever seen. People were building these things all over the place. We forget how weird computers were back then before they crystallized into these extremely boring beige boxes,
What sort of computer did you first grow up with? Like, what did you use when you got into
I
computing?
had a funny early computing experience. My dad's a computer science teacher, and when he was learning to be a computer scientist, he brought home a teletype terminal from the university with an acoustic coupler so we could connect to the PDPs on campus. My mom by that point was a kindergarten teacher, and so a teletype terminal, for people who don't know, and there's no reason you should. This is very old, and you will never have to use one. It doesn't have a screen. So everything the computer wants to say to you, it has to print out. So you read what the computer has printed, and then you type some more things, which are also printed, and then the computer prints some more stuff for you, right? So it's like having a conversation by telegram. And you can only compute if you've got paper. So my mom would bring home 1,000 feet of paper towel from the bathroom at the kindergarten, and we would print up one side of the paper towel, down the other side of the paper towel. Then we'd roll it back up, and it would go back to the kindergarten so the kids could dry their hands on it. And that was my early computing experience for years,
Wow.
on the kitchen table with an acoustic coupler, with a Western Electric, wall phone, hooked into the cradle of the acoustic coupler, what Neil Stevenson calls the informational 69, and having that printer just chatter away.
For those that are listening, Cory was also describing a phone that was attached to the wall with a cord. So just
Indeed.
that was the old way we used to make calls. But
That's it.
Yeah.
But it is
Like
kind of cool, like to have this machine rattling. It's like action at a distance, right? There was a little bit of mystery, a mechanical mystery going on in those days as well. Now everything is so compact and smooth and perfect and gleaming that we don't notice anything. We don't notice.
Yeah.
well, at least you had a modem, Cory. I mean, I started with a VIC 20. That was where I started to code. Same as Elon, I guess, right? And
Well,
I
the
had the
reason-
16K expansion pack,
Sure.
but I didn't have
Sure.
a modem.
Well, the reason we had the modem is that there was no computer, right?
Right.
So it was just a dumb terminal. Without the modem,
Mm.
it would have just been inert, right? The computer was
Right.
many kilometers away in a data center. This was just a printer that was smart enough to take instructions off the wire. It's like having a printer with an extremely long USB cable.
Yeah.
and a keyboard with an extremely long USB cable, and a
I mean,
computer that is somewhere else.
The VT100 green screens were the same, essentially. They were useless
Yeah.
without a connection to, a
But
large
the
computer.
VT stands for video terminal. So this was before video
Oh, yeah.
terminals. This was
Yeah.
back in the days of well, there were video terminals. They were just grotesquely expensive, and computer science students did not get to bring them home from the
Well,
university. You got to bring home these teletypes.
I learned to code on graphite cards where you mark the...
Yeah.
So anyway.
Yeah, that's what my
Okay,
dad.
dinosaurs. Okay, great fun. Remember the thing about
Okay.
And that's what my dad started teaching on. And you would have the kids bubble in their print cards, and then you'd send them to the data center, and they'd run them through and give you an output of how long your program ran before it crashed, which is usually about 3 lines. It was a very bad way to learn how to program. Yeah.
It was interpretive, not compilers, but yeah.
Now we've got Claude teaching us how to write code.
It's interesting. William Gibson has talked a lot about the challenges of writing sci-fi these days because the speed of innovation and things like that. But you chose to go back to the 80s to write. So it's not classic sci-fi what you normally write in that space, but how do you put yourself in that world of the past in compared with what you write about the sci-fi space?
It's funny. I think the world of Bill. I think he's a brilliant guy, but I don't really believe him when he says that it's hard for him to write science fiction because of the changes and things. For one thing, this is a guy who wrote a stonking trilogy in which each volume was set 2 years in the past. So, he went through this period where he wrote very futuristic novels, and then he went through a period where he wrote these novels where he was, as he called it, predicting the present. And then, with the jackpot novels, he started to do a little of both, right? He was writing about the present and the future.
Yeah,
and I think the problem he ran into is he was trying to use that that literary device of talking about the future as a way of illuminating the present. And so it wasn't that the future was catching up with them. It was that the things he wanted to say about the present were changing, right? It wasn't that, like, he's not Nostradamus, right? Like, he's not like, well, I've written my timeline of all the things that are going to happen, and now I have to revise it. He was like, the social commentary I want to make has changed since I started writing this book because of current events, which I think is a very different thing. I was a kid in the 1980s. I was born in 1971, and San Francisco loomed large in my imagination from the beginning. I liked the beat poets, and I read Abby Hoffman's autobiography like 10 times, and I was very excited about computers. I was reading computer magazines. In 1979, we got an Apple II Plus and a modem, and I was using that, and I was really often trying to figure out what was going on the other side of the modem. You get a print magazine full of basic programs that you can key in and run, and there's biographical information, and there's information about the machine it was designed on and the sector that it's coming out of, and so on. And you get this sense of this mysterious place on the other side of the border, on the other side of the continent, where amazing things are happening. And then later in life, I did a startup. I went to San Francisco. I ended up working for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Even before then, I was going out periodically to do contract work for an SGI integrator. I was a Unix administrator. And I got to know the people who had been on the other side of the modem. And in particular, I got to know some of the pioneers because of their involvement with the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And I remember one moment where I was at the Asilomar microcomputing workshop, and I was sitting around with John Gilmore, Upstart EFF, and he created the alt hierarchy on Usenet and a bunch of other things. He wrote GCC and Solaris and Spark Chip and so on. And Tim Posar, who had been his CTO at various ventures, and Tom Jennings, who actually has a cameo in Picks and Shovels. Tom Jennings, a real pioneer. He was he created FidoNet, which was the thing that linked up BBSs in the old days before.
Oh,
we had
yeah. Boy,
he also,
that's long
yeah.
ago.
But he also reverse engineered the Phoenix ROM, or the PC ROM for Phoenix. And that's where you get Compact Dell, Gateway, and all the clone PC companies is using the ROM that he'd reverse engineered. And he was the editor and founder of a radical queer zine called Homo Core, which during the AIDS crisis, when Reagan was basically, his tacit or sometimes even explicit position was gay people should die, that's good. That, he was a real radical firebrand in those days. So the three of them are sitting around at Asilomar Microcomputing Workshop discussing how one day when they were all working at the first dial-up ISP, which John had founded, the Little Garden, they got this idea to merge John's alt hierarchy on Usenet with Tom's FidoNet, right? This store and forward BBS network, and to put a gateway between them. And they're describing this, and I'm like, wait a second. I remember that day, right? I was on the other side of the modem. I remember dialing into my local BBS, which was quite an ordeal. You had to, I had a rotary dial modem. The touch tone modems were too expensive, but there's no way you were going to get into the one phone line of your local BBS, rotary dialing. So instead, you got the touch tone phone to your ear, and you're redialing, hanging up, redialing, hanging up. But if you hear a ring, you use the AT command to have the modem pick up, and then you slam the phone down so that the modem can pick up the call. And I remember one day, I call into my local BBS, and instead of there being like 40 FidoNet feeds, there's like tens of thousands of Usenet feeds. And it was like opening the cupboard door and finding Narnia on the other side. And I have therefore lived in an informed imaginary of that era for quite some time. It's, I have friends in that milieu. It's been professionally very important to me. Being on the other side of it as a kid was very formative to me. And so it came very naturally to me to think about that time and to visit a place that was so vivid in my own imagination. Of course, I've lived in San Francisco many times too.
You do a great job of reconstructing it, even here using words for the audience. So it's fun to listen to. Hey, Brett, we should probably do the lightning round and head out to a break and come back in a minute, and we'll do some futuristic stuff.
Yeah, no, I do want to talk about some of the other stuff too, like down and out in the Magic Kingdom and the reputation economy and stuff like that. It's a bit interesting, but let's have a quick lightning round and get to know you a bit better, Cory. What was the first science fiction you remember being exposed to?
Well, that would have been Doctor Who. And when my mom was at Teachers College, my dad would be home with me and my baby brother, and we would watch Doctor Who on public television on TV Ontario. And every week would be introduced by Judith Merrill, who was this towering figure, a writer, a critic, an editor. And when she and Frederick Pohl divorced, she moved to Toronto with the kids and got a gig on local public TV introducing each week's Doctor Who and talking about where the tropes came from, because she'd been in the Futurian house in New York in the 30s and 40s. She was a great tough old bird, and she had, chain smoker with a great voice, and be like, Tonight's episode is about time loops. I remember we invented time loops at a spaghetti potluck dinner, and it was a difficult night because Isaac Asimov was there and he kept grabbing C.M. Kornbluth's girlfriend's ass. Anyway, we wrote 13 stories about time loops. I took the A train in the morning to Rockefeller Center. I threw them over John W. Campbell's transom, and they all came out over the next year, and that is where time loops come from. It was just terrific.
Interesting. What technology do you think has most changed mankind?
Language, fire.
All right, that's a good one. Fire. Yeah.
Levers are a good one.
Oh yeah.
I'm gonna say levers.
Okay, cool. That's interesting. That's a new one. We had fire before. And I think we've had language before. Okay, is there a futurist or an author that was particularly influential to you in the early parts of your career or even later?
Well, it's going back to Judith Merrill. So Judy, she took the books when she came to Toronto. She took her and Fred Pohl's books and she donated them to the Toronto Public Library, where they formed the nucleus of what's now the largest science fiction reference collection in the world. And she was the writer in residence. It was then called the Spaced Out Library. Now it's called the Merrill Collection. I'm on the board. And as like nice. A 10-year-old, I went down to the library and she was like, kids, if you write stories, you can bring them to me and I will help you make them better. And so, like, from the age of 10, I was bringing stories to her. This is like practicing your slap shot with Wayne Gretzky. And she would put writers she liked in workshops together. So I ended up workshopping with Peter Watts and Carl Schrader and a bunch of other writers that she would gang together. Like every science fiction writer in Toronto was influenced by her in this way. She had these every 6 week potlucks at some science fiction writer's house called Hydra, where we'd have all the editors and writers and critics. She convinced a local fan to found the first science fiction magazine that ever bought a story from me. She convinced another local fan to found the first ever science fiction bookstore where I ended up working. I mean, she basically created the equivalent of a formal apprenticeship for science fiction writers. It was incredible.
Wow, that's great. All right, last question before the break. Is there a science fiction story that you think is most representative of the future you hope for?
I don't know if it's most representative, but I'm a giant fan of Stan Robinson. I think it's his first novel, Pacific Edge. It's part of that Three Californias trilogy.
That. Yeah.
It's the book I read whenever I feel low, and it's really informed how I think about like complicated utopias, because it's not a place where we've solved all our problems, but it's a place where we're rising to the challenges.
Yeah. Wasn't that where he had cars that ran on sort of monorail infrastructure on the freeways?
That's
or
one
something?
of the other volumes. So he wrote different books set in the same year in California in 3 different futures. One was like a hyper-capitalist hellscape, one was a nuclear wasteland, and one was an ecotopian utopia.
Yeah. Very cool. Well, let's take a quick break. Rob, you want to take us to break?
Yeah, sure thing. You're listening to The Futurists with Cory Doctorow this week. We'll be back in just a minute. Hey there, you're listening to The Futurist. I'm Rob Tercek with Brett King, and this week we're talking to Cory Doctorow. Cory, tell us a little bit about your work with the EEF, and particularly bring it up to this present moment that we find ourselves in.
So I've been working with the Electronic Frontier Foundation for about 23 years now, and I've worked on many different campaigns. I was their European director for some years, and broadly speaking, I would say that the defining ethos of my career there has been trying to safeguard and expand technological self-determination, the right to decide how the gadgets and services you use work. And, that has gone from being sort of a consumer rights issue to being an existential crisis, right? Deciding whether or not your car can repo itself has a dimension to it that is like much more intense than, whether or not your ebook reader lets you switch in ebooks from another vendor. And, deciding whether the computer you use rats you out to your boss if you try to organize a union on it is even more existential still.
We've actually just seen that. The UK managed to successfully force Apple to step down its so-called staunch commitment to privacy. And that seems like the thin end of the wedge. We're going to start to see governments intrude more and more into our personal devices, I think.
Well, to be clear, Apple hasn't done it yet. They just said they will. So the UK passed a law, and I was based in Britain, and I founded an EFF style organization there called the Open Rights Group. And we worked really hard against this law that the UK passed in 2016, the Investigative Powers Act, which is colloquially called the Snoopers Charter, and it contains a provision that allows them to create secret orders that cannot be disclosed, forcing companies to modify their technology to facilitate eavesdropping, to facilitate interception and surveillance. And so they served Apple with one of these warrants, and they said, you need to make it possible for us to read the cloud backups of any Mac user or iOS user. And the thing is, if you're going to keep that secret, you can't just do it in the UK, because people will notice that the software works differently. People who are like reverse engineers and decompilers and so on, they will notice the software works differently. So the only way to comply with that order and with its secrecy component is to disable working encryption for every Apple user everywhere in the world, and to insert these backdoors, which allow anyone who can either impersonate British law enforcement or suborn British law enforcement or discover a defect that has been introduced in the process of adding this backdoor, allow them to compromise anyone. And you'll remember that if just a few years ago we had this horrible leak. They called it the Fappening. It's kind of a gross name, but it was about leaking the nude images of celebrities. But also, this kind of intrusion is often a prelude to spear phishing attacks and ransomware attacks. It's kind of how you get the information you need to harm people in other ways. So it's a really high risk activity. Yeah. Apple, basically faced with this game where there was no way to win, decided not to play. And they said, rather than backdooring the secure backups of Britons, we will just turn off secure backups for Britons. And that way there is no security, so you can read everything, but we also will not have to downgrade the security of everyone. It's pretty bad, but to return to the theme of my work with EFF, it's really important to ask how Apple came to this juncture. Because for about 15 years now, Apple has been making devices that by design, you do not have technological self-determination over. You can't choose to install software that Apple doesn't want you to have. They have arrogated themselves the right to decide how your device works, even after you buy it. And when they did that, we warned them, once you have that power, someone's going to ask you to use it on their behalf, right? Governments are going to show up and say, you can degrade or disable the security on devices. You can remove access to tools and information sources that we would rather people in our borders not have, and you're going to get pressurized. And of course, that happened when the FBI asked Apple to downgrade the security for the San Bernardino shooter's phone. But it also happened in China, where Apple caved, because they need access to the giant Chinese market, 500,000 middle-class consumers. They also need access to Chinese manufacturing. And so long ago, they downgraded the security of iCloud backups. They removed all working VPNs. And then during the last Party Congress, when Xi Jinping was renewing his mandate, in order to help suppress protests against this, they disabled anonymous document sharing and airdrop at the request of the Chinese authorities. So, once you put the mantelpiece on the gun in Act 1, you really can't act surprised that it's gone off in Act 3. And this was a thing that we warned them about. And, you asked me about my career at EFF. Having done this now for 23 years, I am frustrated and angry that named individuals in living memory took policy decisions that they were warned would result in the outcomes that we are currently living through, did it anyway, got rich, and have never faced any consequences. And so, the law that Bill Clinton signed in 1998, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, that makes it a felony to jailbreak a device like an iPhone, they were warned, right? Mm-hmm. In fact, his copyright czar tried to get this proposal through Al Gore at the National Information Infrastructure hearings, this information superhighway hearings, and Al Gore laughed him out of the room. So in his own words, Bruce Lehman, the IP czar, he did an end run around Congress. He went to the UN agency WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, and got them to pass 2 treaties, the Internet treaties, the WIPO Performers and Phonograms treaties, and the WIPO copyright treaties, that imposed the obligation on America to enact this law that they had already decided not to have, right? So, Bruce Lehman's still around. He's rich. He's respected. That guy should be like, his name should be Mud, right? We should all like swing a noisemaker when they mention his name, like it was Purim. And instead, he's just walking around like he didn't destroy the internet.
Yeah.
These decisions have long consequences. So that's part of the mission of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, is to serve as that warning signal, that canary in the coal mine, and let people know that decisions that are being mooted right now by clueless politicians are going to change the landscape years in the future. But as I mentioned in the beginning of the show, we live in a time of permanent present and kind of instant amnesia, and events are coming at us so fast, and people feel like there's so much on the back foot reacting to this flurry of events. We have a hard time making that connection. I think many of us have a hard time making a connection to an event that happened just before the pandemic. We tend to forget the origins of these things, and then we'll find ourselves one day living with the consequences and wondering how we got there and how we can do something different about it. It doesn't seem to me that you're a pessimistic person, even though you confront very dire situations like this on a daily basis. How do you maintain your optimism?
Well, I wouldn't call myself an optimist either. I think optimism and pessimism are really flip sides of the same kind of dismal coin that holds that the world will either get better or worse, but it doesn't matter what we do, right? That this is, defeats you before you even get out of bed in the morning. I'm a person with a lot of hope. And I define hope as the idea that if you materially change your circumstances, that you will ascend up a gradient towards a better world. And as you attain a new higher vantage point, you will spy other activities you can take, other moves you can make that will help you ascend the gradient further. And so even when I'm confronted with something as dismal as the moment we're living in now, I'm always looking for what we could do that would positively affect the lie of the land, so that we might have a more advantageous starting point when the next turn starts. And, right now I'm very interested in the fact that most countries in the world have enacted laws that ban reverse engineering and modifications at the behest of the U.S. Trade Representative, who wanted to make sure that no one was going to make a third-party ink cartridge that would challenge HP's ability to charge $10,000 a gallon for colored water, that no one would make a tool that allowed an independent mechanic to fix a car, or better yet, jailbreak a Tesla, so that you can have all the downloadable content, all the subscription features for free forever. And when you sell the car, it goes with the car, so your car's now worth more. That no one would ever jailbreak an iPhone to add their own app store to it, so that software authors could sell software to their customers without giving Apple 30% of every dollar they made and every dollar that the software generated over its lifetime, which is the deal that Apple has for payment processing. And the reason that countries around the world were pressurized by the U.S. Trade Representative to do this, and the reason they caved, is that the U.S. Trade Representative was negotiating free trade agreements. And he was saying, if you want to have the Australia-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, or the various agreements between the EU and the U.S., that you are required to put these laws on your books. Well, I don't know if you've heard, but Donald Trump is staging an unscheduled mid-air disassembly of the International Free Trade Order. And if Canada is not going to have tariff-free access to the U.S. markets, why are we still making it illegal for Canadian businesses to jailbreak Teslas? Look, if you're angry at Elon Musk because of his Nazi salute, don't just wander around being performatively outraged. Figure out how to make him broke.
Break a Tesla.
Yeah. Yeah. So, this is a huge opportunity. It's how you win a trade war. Retaliatory tariffs are so stupid, right? Canada charging a 25% tariff on U.S. goods. So the U.S. goods Canadians buy, which are most of the goods Canadians buy, because the years since NAFTA have been a long process of dismantling Canadian manufacturing and reconfiguring the Canadian economy to be like an open pit mine to serve American manufacturers. And so now everything's going to be 25% more expensive in Canada. That is a weird way to punish America. On the other hand, if you want to go after the most valuable companies in the S&P 500, the companies that have made the S&P 500 sit in the black for a decade, you take the tech giants out, they're the S&P 500 is a money loser, right? So if you want to strike at their court, you hit those businesses, and you hit them in their most profitable lines of business: service, parts, materials, software, add-ons, support, all of those things where they use digital locks that are against the law in Canada to break, to enforce a monopoly. Break the monopoly, let it run through local businesses, move that economic activity to Canada, kick America in the dongle.
It it's a funny thing to think about, but don't you think that would lead to a downward spiral, a tit for tat battle where every country,
But
I should
isn't
say,
that what
because
we're in already?
Oh, I
are
hope
we?
it does. No. That's how
Yeah.
we're going to get it in Canada. Someone in Mexico is going to think about it, and Canada's going to go, oh, if we don't move fast, this business is going to go to Mexico. Every country in the world should be jailbreaking American gadgets and their own. Look, last year, a group of Polish pen testers were hired by one of the train companies because they had these Nuvog trains. Nuvog is a Polish manufacturer. They had these Nuvog trains that kept bricking themselves. And it turned out that the trains had been booby-trapped, so that if you took them to a third-party service depot, they'd brick themselves. And then you had to call the manufacturer and pay 20,000 euros for them to send an unlock code to the train. Although they weren't mentioning this. They didn't tell me it was a secret. They actually, one of their other customers, their trains kept shutting down unexpectedly when they went on a certain piece of track. And it was because whoever at Nuvog was in charge of drawing a rectangle on a map around a nearby third-party service depot, drew the rectangle too wide and captured some mainline track. And so any train that went over that track just stopped moving because it looked like it was in a third-party service depot. So Article 6 of the European
That's pretty
Copyright
crazy.
Directive, which was conjured into existence by the U.S. Trade Representative in Europe in 2001, Article 6 makes it a crime to reverse engineer any kind of digital lock, including the lock on the train. So these researchers, they have been repeatedly threatened with both criminal and civil sanction for coming forward with this information. Like, Poland should get that goddamn law off its books. Like, it's an affront to dignity that we have that law in its books. During the lockdown, Medtronic, which is the largest medtech company in the world, they bought all the rival medtech companies. Then they did the largest tax inversion in history. They pretend they're an Irish company now, so they don't have to pay taxes. They couldn't service their workhorse ventilators anymore. So they're the world's leading manufacturer of ventilators. Most ventilators in the West and then in the North are made by Medtronic. And they all use what's called parts pairing, which is like digital rights management for parts. So after you swap in a part and initialize it, you have to type in an unlock code that is known only to an authorized Medtronic service technician, which just allows Medtronic to charge you $200 to fix your ventilator. And so you have hospital med techs, like staff med techs, like marrying the working screen from a dead ventilator to a working ventilator with a dead screen, but they couldn't unlock the screen because of the parts pairing. And again, an anonymous Polish technician built a defeat device, a radioactively illegal defeat device using a little embedded systems processor, like a system on a chip, like I don't know, Raspberry Pi or something. And he started just building them into random housings, guitar pedals, table lamps, clock radios as housings, and just mailing them anonymously to hospitals. And he had to do that because he could have gone to prison if they had found out who was doing it. Right? We should get these laws off our books. Like, that is not a race to the bottom. Getting these laws off our books is a race to the top.
So your point is that the U.S. Trade Representative is pushing this copyright law and these kinds of protections for American hardware for decades, right? Since the Clinton administration, they've been baking them into bilateral treaties and multilateral trade agreements. And now, if the United States is going to change the laws unilaterally or change the trade agreements unilaterally, it's time for everyone to go back and tear up those old agreements and start over again. I want to put a pitch in here for your book.
Gorilla.
One of my favorite books of all time. Information Doesn't Want to Be Free. Look, I have the autographed copy right here. It's 10 years old, but it holds up very well.
Thank you.
So Cory, there seems to be a bit of a central theme running through here, you know, from choke point capitalism to radicalized and so forth. It doesn't appear like you're a big fan of capitalism, or at least the current version of capitalism that we have. But put your sci-fi hat on now and talk to us about how you think we're going to morph out of that, because there's a lot of discussion of that we're in late stage capitalism right now, and we need much more consensus building, particularly to attack things like climate change and so forth in the future. And we need different sort of system order thinking. How do you see this evolving?
Well, I'd say, as to capitalism, I broadly share Marx and Engels' view of capitalism. They were giant fans of it, right? If you read chapter 1 of the Communist Manifesto, they're just geeking out about how amazingly productive market economies are. And they're like, this is the thing that will give us the surplus that we need to move out of market allocations, because there's some things markets are really bad at. And we're in one of those moments right now where markets are really bad, for example, at breaking up monopolies. You cannot shop your way out of a monopoly. Markets are really bad at addressing the climate emergency, right? Like every desperate, sweaty thing where we try to marketize climate problems, like selling carbon credits or whatever, they just suck and they fail. And it's like we've tried everything that doesn't work and we've run out of ideas, right? So, my friend Deb Chakra, you should have on the show. She's a material scientist. She wrote a book last year called How Infrastructure Works. And she makes the point that if you could capture 0.4% of the solar radiation that strikes the Earth's surface, not water, but landmass, you could give every person on Earth the energy budget of a Canadian, which is like an American but colder, right? And obviously this is a very prodigious material problem, right? There's many people have pointed out that you need a lot of materials for this, but when you actually add up the materials you need, the material bill is not that big. So the by volume, it's about 1/17 of the material we extract every year in the process of extracting and refining fossil fuels. So we do it just once, and then we have the energy we need forever. And Deb points out that for most of human history, we have treated materials as though they were abundant and energy as though it were scarce. But the Earth has a fixed allocation of materials, and asteroid mining is nonsense. What we get is what we got, plus the odd stray meteorite that survives entry through the atmosphere. That's it. But we have renewable energy, right? We get a fresh shipment of energy every time the sun comes up, and another one every time the moon starts to exert a tidal stress.
And we still don't use it.
And we don't use it, right? So we have all this access to things. If we can figure out how to reorient our economy, which is going to require a lot of central planning around marshaling the materials to build this kind of electrification system, we will have a world in which we can reclaim materials, right? When we talk about materials being single use, and for example, like depleted lithium in a battery being unsalvageable and so on, so you have to go find another place and dig it up to get more lithium. What we actually mean is that it's too energy intensive to recover the materials after they've been used, or it's too energy intensive to build the device such that it gracefully degrades back into the material stream. Once energy is free, right? Once we have marshaled all the energy, marshaled the materials we need to get the energy, we can make the materials last and last and last and last. So I'm a kind of Promethean leftist. I don't think that every peasant should live like, or every lord should live like a peasant. I think every peasant should live like a lord. I think that we are more abundant when we don't have to own one of everything, each one of us. I'm a homeowner in Los Angeles, which means I own a drill. But because the only thing I use it for is hanging the odd picture, I own the minimum viable drill. And it's a drill that is always on the verge of exploding and showering me with white hot shrapnel. If there was just circulating stochastic clouds of drills in my neighborhood that were made as good as the contractor's drill, that, sort of were location aware and gathering analytics about how they were used, and that's being built back into the next round of drills, and it's not a market-based allocation, so you're building drills to a spec that it just wouldn't make any sense in a market economy. That would be more abundant. I wouldn't have to devote a drawer in my limited floor space to a shitty drill. I just have the drill when I needed it, and then it would go away when I didn't need it. Look, it is not like a sign of a abundant, rich society if you have to carry toilet paper with you everywhere you go, right? You live in an abundant, rich society if every time you need it, there's toilet paper just sitting there, right? The weird world that we've entered, where everyone has to have a car that they drive for 15 minutes a day, and everyone has to have a drill that they use once a year, and everyone has to have a lawnmower they use 5 times a year. This is not an abundant world. And I'm not talking World Economic Forum, you'll own nothing and you'll like it. I'm just talking about the toilet paper system, but for other stuff.
I was with one of the largest financial institutions, one of the most well-known financial institutions in the world today. And I talked about the fact that, eventually, because of AI and because of the ability to infinitely scale production and so forth, we are going to have to get off the consumption train, and we're going to have to look at ways to be sustainable. And he said, "Oh, that's such a depressing thought. I hope that never happens." And I was like,
Well, it's our one idea, right? We have one
yeah,
idea about how to make money, which is to make a thing and sell it to everybody. It's the idea if every person in China buys your product, you're going to be a billionaire. We're missing the sense, at least with information products, it
I
doesn't
like Brock
necessarily have to work.
Pierce's definition of a billionaire. Rob, he says a billionaire should be a person or a company that positively influences the lives of a billion people. I think that's
Yeah,
a good way to think about it.
Brock is great at that sort of grandiose statement.
Anyway,
So looking out into the future, putting on our futurist hat, where are we heading right now? It looks like we're heading into a world where the United States is going to be dominated by an oligarchy. It looks like our Congress is supine, unable to defend its purpose. It seems quite evident that our current president is on a collision course with the Supreme Court, and he's going to do the classic Andrew Jackson, where he says, okay, you want to make a ruling, you enforce it, and he'll selectively enforce or not enforce, depending on his whim. He's changing the rules of the international order. He's tearing up agreements that we've had for 80 years with countries that we consider to be allies and partners. Where does this end up? Give me a picture of the world, not 50 years out, 4 years from now.
Oh, I have to disappoint you because I don't believe in prediction. I'm an activist, right? I'm not trying to figure out what the world is going to be like. I'm trying to figure out how I can change the world. So all of those things that you describe, I agree, right? They are problematic, not universally so. I mean, some of those international agreements, as I said, are good riddance to them. You know, the CIA facing its largest headcount reduction since the Bay of Pigs. I'm not going to mourn that. That's great. Like the organization that figured out how to fund Contra so they could tie nuns to trees and bayonet them for supporting peasant movements. Like, this is not a thing I'm going to miss. So I look at the lie of the land changing and I think about where I can make the most ground. And right now, as I said, I think it's in these international agreements. I think it's getting other countries. And if we can get those other countries to start dismantling the digital prisons that American firms have built, that stuff blows back to America, right? Like, imagine, for example, that countries all over the world are competing to build universal diagnostic and repair devices for cars, right? So, maybe that stabilizes into a $30 a month subscription where the company is buying every car as it comes off the line, figuring out how to jailbreak it. They're taking every new firmware update that's pushed out over the air, figuring out how to jailbreak that. And so every day you're getting new updates, new profiles. And so as a mechanic, you can just fix any car. How are they going to stop American mechanics from buying that product? Right?
Yeah.
If there's payment processing and an internet connection, because like the part where the car meets the laptop that's running the software is a USB cable, right? So how do they stop Americans from using that product? And you add that up by, or you multiply that by 1,000 different lines of business, and what you have is something that crashes the wealth of the oligarch class, right? And that's where their power arises from. And I don't know that that's going to solve all of Americans' problems, but I do know that that is a better position to be solving problems from than one in which they have an endless supply of rents flowing in from around the world that they extract using their terrible digital technologies.
hey Cory, just before we wrap, because we do have to wrap, but I want to get your opinion on how you would navigate AI in this. Particularly, I heard Eric Schmidt talking about this the other day, and he said that the arrival of a non-human intelligence is a really big deal. And I've been thinking about this a lot lately, about the fact that we're going to have to negotiate with a much more logical reasoning, system potentially with this, and AIs may tell us stuff that we don't want to hear in respect to how we can solve some of these problems. It may say, for example, why are you guys putting hydrocarbons into the atmosphere, given what it's doing? 8 million people dying every year from air pollution as a start, and why are you doing X, Y, and Z? And we're going to have to justify this to this, higher order, higher reasoning intelligence. How do you think, as an activist, How are you thinking about how AI can be integrated into society in a safe way?
So again, I'm going to have to disappoint you because I don't think AI reasons, and I don't think it will. I think the idea that if we take the spicy autocomplete and we shovel more data at it, it will wake up and become intelligent and learn how to reason is like the idea that if we breed horses to become successively faster, that eventually one of them will give birth to a locomotive. Uh, I just don't think that reasoning and intelligence is the product of like stochastic analysis of vocabulary words and engrams in a literary corpus performed at a high enough scale, right? I just don't think that's the case. And I think, it's not to say that AI doesn't do useful things. I know lots of people who use AI in interesting and useful ways. I used it last week. I was trying to write an article and I wanted to cite something I'd heard on a podcast and I couldn't remember which one it was. And so I generated transcripts of about 5 podcasts that I thought it might be, and then I could search the text, right? So, AI transcriptions, amazing. I sometimes use Google's Magic Paintbrush on my Pixel phone to remove people from images. I shoot a lot of pictures and release them Creative Commons licensed so that other people can have them as stock art. And it's always problematic when there's people in them, both for privacy and because it's just not as good as stock. And so the Magic Eraser is very cool. I think you take all that stuff, you take everything that people are using them for that they are useful, and you multiply them by 10, and you're still not paying for the kombucha budget for the guys who oversaw the training run. So I think these foundation models are doomed. I think they're all going to go out of business. And I think anything that relies on interactivity with a foundation model, it's going to be like having asbestos in the walls. Like we're just going to have these services that are like permanently poisoned with tons of tech debt that you're going to have to go through for years to rip out. And I am interested in these kind of standalone models, on-device models. They're pretty cool, particularly for doing small, useful things. And what I'm most interested in is the fact that even if the company that made them goes bust, they're still useful, right? So I think when you talk about bubbles, it's worthwhile to talk about whether the bubble leaves behind a useful or a useless residue. So like Enron didn't leave anything behind, right? Cryptocurrency, like maybe a little bit of like secure programming in Rust, but mostly just bad Austrian economics and JPEGs. WorldCom was a giant scam, but it did leave a lot of dark fiber in the ground that we're lighting up now.
YouTube has them to thank.
Yeah. Web 1.0, the dot-com bubble, it stole a lot of pension money from normies, but it did turn like a couple million humanities undergraduates into Python programmers and HTML jocks, and that's where we got Web 2.0, right? So, like, I just don't know what AI is going to leave behind. I think the foundation models, like the fact that OpenAI now has a $200 a month product that loses money on every query tells you that they're going to really struggle, right? But those standalone models, those on-device models, we'll still be using them after the companies have gone up. So maybe we'll find something useful to do with them. I know, my friend Patrick Ball runs a nonprofit called the Human Rights Data Analysis Group. They work on genocide, truth and reconciliation, and human rights tribunals. And like they used an LLM to deduplicate all the death records from the Colombian Civil War, which is a project no human could have ever done. And then they produced a characterization with a confidence interval for each death as to whether it was caused by FARC leftist guerrillas or right-wing militias backed by the CIA or the military, or whether it was an unrelated death, someone died in a bar fight. And this has been hugely important to the truth and reconciliation trials in Colombia. It's the largest human rights data set ever assembled. No human being could have done this. No group of humans could have done this. It would have been a 100-year project. So this is a really, useful use for it. But Human Rights Data Analysis Group runs on a shoestring. They are never going to pay off the training or the GPUs or the salary costs, the running costs. None of that stuff is ever going to emerge from 1,000 of these. And if you were to immiserate and pauperize every single commercial illustrator in the world by replacing them with Llama or whatever, you would not touch the Uber bills for driving drunk employees home from the AI companies that made that stuff. Illustrate, like, the total commercial illustration market is infinitesimal. And really what you see is illustrators being used as a disposable rocket stage, right? It's just an expensive demo for proving that the technology might be useful someday while emulsifying a whole industry of helpless people who make art that make people happy. So I wonder like what useful residue will be left behind, but I don't give a lot of thought to like how we will cope with the big companies now. They're as soon as they stop getting these trade subsidies and policy subsidies and cash subsidies from governments, they're going to be out of business.
Yeah.
That was quite a wild ride. Folks, you've been listening to Cory Doctorow, and he is currently on his book tour.
He has been preaching.
And definitely check out Books, Picks, and Shovels and his many other books. Cory, tell us where we can find you on the web. I know you've got a couple different places, Crap Hound and your blog.
Yeah, pluralistic.net's the place to go. I write a mostly daily newsletter that's open access, Creative Commons licensed, and it's syndicated to Twitter, Tumblr, Mastodon, RSS. There's an email version. And wherever I can, it's surveillance free, it's ad free, it's analytics free. I don't know how many people read it. You can reprint it commercially. Wired periodically picks up articles from and republishes them. There's a German business daily that translates them and publishes it. You can read it too. You can read it in any of the forums that you like. Cool. I manually syndicate it to all of those, convert it to threads and so on and post them on Twitter and Mastodon. So follow me wherever you like. All the links are across the top of pluralistic.net.
Great. Okay. So Cory Doctorow, thank you very much for joining us this week on The Futurists. Brett and I have enjoyed the conversation. It's a wild ride listening to you go. And folks, we'll be back next week with another person who's thinking about and shaping and influencing the future. Until then, Brett and I will see you in the future.
In the future.